His appearance resembled that of any other reserve cattleman. Calloused palms, scuffed leather boots, a fellow who voiced thoughts only when essential. Yet when Silas Ward witnessed his housekeeper hobbling through the cooking area that dawn, his findings would rattle the law enforcement headquarters to its foundation. The homestead rested in the depression as though it had been sculpted from the soil itself, constructed entirely of aged timber and genuine toil. Silas had constructed it using his own strength 15 years prior. Each support timber positioned with identical meticulous focus. He devoted everything to his existence. His faith lay in uncomplicated matters, diligent effort, equitable compensation, and honoring commitments. The sort of individual who compensated his workers punctually and never inquired about their origins. Mercy Whitmore had appeared 3 months earlier, clutching desperation within her gaze. Youthful, perhaps 20 years old, bearing the exhausted expression that revealed hardships exceeding her age. She required employment. He required assistance maintaining the dwelling. That arrangement sufficed for them both. Her preference was solitude. She performed her duties competently, and Silas honored that choice. Through his understanding, individuals who converse less typically possess greater value when they eventually spoke their thoughts. However, this dawn differed. Silas had returned from inspecting the livestock, his boots creating heavy sounds on the timber porch when he glimpsed her through the window. Mercy moved through the cooking area as though each movement extracted something from her. Her right limb dragged somewhat, and periodically she would halt, grasping the table's edge or a chair's back, her expression tense with pain she attempted to conceal. He remained motionless for an extended moment, observing through the glass. This wasn't his initial observation of something unusual regarding her movements. However, today proved worse, significantly worse. Her method of favoring her left side, the cautious manner she lowered herself to retrieve a fallen utensil, reminded him of his aged horse's movement following a severe tumble. Injured, yet attempting to disguise it, Silas pushed through the entrance, the hinges producing their customary greeting creak. Mercy immediately straightened, tried to regain composure, but he had already witnessed sufficient evidence. Her complexion became ashen, and momentarily, he detected something in her eyes that caused his chest constrict. Terror, not directed at him, but terror nonetheless. She returned to cooking surface, stirring a coffee vessel with movements excessively careful and controlled. "Good morning, Mr. Ward. The coffee will be prepared shortly." Her voice contained that identical forced cheerfulness he'd heard from wounded creatures. The sound of something attempting to convince the world of its wellness when clearly suffering. Silas suspended his hat on the door peg and examined her back, her shoulder positioning, the slight trembling in her hand as she reached for coffee cups. Everything communicated a narrative she wasn't prepared to reveal. However, Silas Ward had spent sufficient years interpreting signals, atmospheric conditions, creature conduct, the subtle communications of terrain, to recognize when something was gravely amiss. Whatever was affecting Mercy Whitmore was deteriorating. The inquiry remained whether her injury resulted from a mishap or if someone was deliberately harming her. Should it prove the latter, Silas would need to determine his true character. Silas received the coffee cup from Mercy's shaking hands, his fingers grazing hers momentarily. Her skin felt cold despite the kitchen's warmth, and he sensed a recoil at the contact. Not a startled person's reaction, but someone anticipating pain. He sipped the coffee, studying her over the cup's rim. She maintained her back toward him, occupying herself with unnecessary counter tasks, cleaning already spotless surfaces, rearranging items requiring no organization. The frantic activity typical of someone wishing to vanish without departing the room. "Mercy," he spoke softly. She tensed, her hands freezing on the cloth she'd used to clean the identical counter spot thrice. "Yes, sir." "You're injured." The statement wasn't questioned, and both understood this. The subsequent silence extended between them like suspended breath. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere distant, its melody bright and carefree in the morning atmosphere. Inside the kitchen, only the mantel clock's gentle ticking and Mercy's irregular breathing whispered. When she finally faced him, Silas observed something that tightened his jaw. Her lip was split on the left side, the wound fresh enough to remain unhealed. A yellowing bruise covered her cheekbone, mostly concealed by her forward-pulled hair. However, her eyes revealed everything he needed to understand. They contained the dull acceptance of someone who'd ceased believing improvement was possible. "I tumbled," she stated, the words emerging too rapidly. "Clumsy of me. Stumbled over my own feet, descending the stairs yesterday evening." Silas placed his coffee cup down with intentional care. He'd heard sufficient falsehoods throughout his life to recognize their sound. This one fell hollow in the air between them, as empty as a vacant grain storage. "Display these stairs to me," he requested. Mercy's face became pale. "Sir, the stairs you fell down. I wish to examine them." She opened her mouth, then sealed it again. Both knew no stairs existed in the small cabin where she resided, just behind the main house. It was constructed on flat ground with a single step leading to the front entrance. Silas had built that cabin himself, identical to everything else on his property. He knew every inch of it. The falsehood hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, bitter and obvious. Mercy's hands twisted in her apron, and momentarily, Silas thought she might reveal the truth. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and raised her chin with defiance that would have been admirable if not so heartbreaking. "I should return to my duties," she declared. Silas watched her turn away again, noting her movement with the careful, measured steps of someone who knew precisely how much movement would bring pain. Whatever had occurred to her wasn't the first instance. Her posture, the practiced method of concealing her injuries. This was someone's behavior who'd learned survival through silence and hiding. However, as Mercy limped toward the pantry, Silas Ward reached a decision that would transform everything. He would discover who was harming his employee. Upon finding them, that person would learn what happened when crossing a man who'd spent his entire life believing that protecting what was his wasn't merely a responsibility. It was a sacred obligation. The sole question now was whether the truth would exceed his preparation to handle it. That afternoon, Silas found himself doing something unprecedented, observing his own property as though a stranger might lurk in the shadows. He positioned himself near the barn where he could see the path leading from town to Mercy's cabin, pretending to repair a broken harness while his eyes tracked every movement across his land. The sun began its descent toward the horizon when he spotted the approaching rider. Even from a distance, Silas recognized Deputy Vernon Briggs's slouched posture and swaggering gait. The man rode as though he owned every piece of ground his horse's hooves touched, his badge catching the late afternoon light with each saddle bounce. Silas had never favored Briggs. The deputy possessed a cruel streak running deep as a dry well, and a manner of regarding people as though they owed him something merely for existing. He represented the type of lawman who enjoyed power more than justice, and everyone in town knew it. However, knowing it and acting upon it were vastly different matters. Briggs dismounted near Mercy's cabin and secured his horse to the post Silas had installed for visitors. However, this didn't resemble any official visit. The deputy glanced around nervously, ensuring he wasn't being observed before knocking on Mercy's door with his hands back, forcefully enough that Silas could hear sound from 50 yards away. The door opened almost immediately, as if Mercy had been waiting. From his barn position, Silas couldn't discern words, but he could read body language clearly. Briggs pushed his way inside without invitation, and Mercy stepped back, her posture submissive and frightened. The door closed behind them, and Silas felt his hands clench into fists. Every instinct urged him to march over there and settle this as his father would have, with his fists and principles. However, something restrained him. Perhaps it was knowing that a confrontation with a deputy might worsen things for Mercy. Or maybe it was realizing he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before acting. 20 minutes passed. 20 lengthy minutes during which Silas wore a groove in the dirt with his pacing, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. When the cabin door finally reopened, Briggs emerged first, adjusting his gun belt with a satisfied air of someone who'd obtained what he came for. Mercy appeared in the doorway behind him. Even from a distance, Silas could see she was holding herself differently, more carefully with more pain. Briggs mounted his horse and rode toward town without looking back, whistling a tune that carried on the evening air like an insult. Mercy stood in her doorway for an extended moment, one hand pressed against the frame, as if she needed it to remain upright. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. Silas stood there in the gathering dusk, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place in his mind. A deputy with excessive power and insufficient conscience. A young woman with nowhere to go and no one to protect her. Now, he knew why Mercy had been limping. The question was what he would do about it. The following morning arrived gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low over the valley like a wool blanket. Silas had spent the night staring at his bedroom ceiling, his mind churning through possibilities and plans. By dawn's break, he'd made his decision. He found Mercy in the kitchen again, moving even more carefully than the previous day. She didn't meet his eyes when she served his breakfast, and he noticed she pulled her hair forward to cover fresh bruises on her neck. The sight of them made something cold and hard settle in his chest. "Mercy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She froze with the coffee pot halfway to his cup. "Sir, Deputy Briggs has been coming around here, hasn't he?" The coffee pot trembled in her hands. For a moment, Silas thought she might drop it entirely. When she finally set it down on the table, her movements were jerky and uncertain. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I saw him yesterday. I saw him come to your cabin, and I saw how you looked when he left." Silas kept his voice steady, but inside, he was fighting a rage that threatened to consume him. How long has this been going on? Mercy's composure cracked like ice on a warming pond. Her shoulders began to shake, and when she finally looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a deputy. Who's going to believe me over him? Who's going to care what happens to someone like me?" The words came out in a rush then, like water through a broken dam. She told him about coming to town 3 months ago, running from troubles back east, about how Briggs had noticed her that first day, cornering her behind a general store with promises that turned into threats, about how he'd made it clear that she belonged to him now, whether she liked it or not. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I disappeared. Said there were mines in these mountains where nobody would ever find me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'd done it before. Silas felt something inside him go very still and very cold. He'd known Vernon Briggs was a bully and a coward, but this was something else entirely. This was evil, plain and simple. "Why didn't you leave town?" he asked. Mercy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? Where would I go? He made sure everyone knew I was under his protection. Nobody would hire me. Nobody would help me. You were the only one who'd even give me work." Silas stood up slowly, his hands flat on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire kitchen. "He's not going to hurt you anymore. Mr. Ward, you can't. He'll kill you. Or he'll get the sheriff to arrest you for something you didn't do. These men, they protect each other." But Silas was already moving toward the door, his mind clear for the first time since this whole mess started. He paused with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. "There's something you should know about me, Mercy. I've never been much for talking, but I've always been real good at making sure the right thing gets done." He stepped out into the gray morning, leaving Mercy staring after him with fear and something that might have been hope warring in her eyes. The walk to town would take him an hour. That gave him plenty of time to decide exactly how he was going to handle Deputy Vernon Briggs. And one way or another, this was going to end today. The town of Cedar Falls sat in a dusty bowl between two hills, its main street lined with buildings that had seen better days. Silas walked down the center of that street with a steady gait of a man who'd made peace with what he had to do. People noticed him. They always did when Silas Ward came to town, because he only made the trip when it mattered. He found Deputy Briggs exactly where he expected to, leaning against the post outside the saloon, badge glinting in the weak morning sun, talking loud enough for half the street to hear about some poor soul he'd run out of town the week before. Briggs was the kind of man who needed an audience for his cruelty. Silas stopped about 10 feet away and waited. It took Briggs a moment to notice him standing there, and when he did, something shifted in the deputy's expression. Maybe it was the way Silas held himself, or maybe it was something in his eyes, but Briggs straightened up and let his hand drift toward his gun. Well, If it isn't the hermit rancher, Briggs said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. What brings you to town, Ward? Finally ready to be sociable. I came to talk to you about Mercy Whitmore. The words dropped into morning air like stones into still water. Briggs's face went through several expressions, surprise, calculation, then a slow, ugly smile. Don't know who you're talking about, Briggs said, but his eyes had gone hard and flat. I think you do. Silas took a step closer. I think you know her real well. The crowd was growing now, drawn by the tension crackling between the two men. Silas could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversation starting up. Good. He wanted witnesses for this. You got something to say to me, Ward? You better say it plain, Briggs snarled, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. Silas looked around at the gathered faces. Shopkeepers, farmers, wives with children peeking out from behind their skirts. These were people who'd lived with Briggs's brutality for years, too afraid or too powerless to do anything about it. I'm saying that you've been hurting a woman who works for me, Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I'm saying that you're a coward who uses his badge to prey on people who can't fight back. The crowd went dead silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping nervously at their hitching posts. Briggs's face turned red, then purple. That's a serious accusation, Ward. You got any proof of these lies you're spreading? Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I do, actually. The paper was blank, just something he grabbed from his desk before leaving the ranch. But Briggs didn't know that, and the way the deputy's eyes locked onto it told Silas everything he needed to know about how guilty the man really was. See, the thing about secrets, Silas said, unfolding the paper slowly, is that they have a way of coming to light when you least expect it. Briggs drew his gun. The weapon came up fast, but Silas was already moving. 15 years of ranch work had given him reflexes like a mountain cat, and he'd been expecting this moment since he'd walked into town. He dove to the left as Briggs pulled the trigger, the bullet whining past his ear to splinter the wooden post behind him. The crowd scattered like startled birds, but Silas rolled his feet and charged. Briggs was trying to aim his gun for a second shot when Silas's shoulder caught him in the midsection, driving them both back against the saloon wall with enough force to rattle the windows. They grappled for the gun, Briggs cursing and spitting as he tried to bring it to bear. But Silas had spent his life wrestling cattle and hauling timber, and his hands were iron from years of honest work. He twisted Briggs's wrist until the deputy cried out and dropped the weapon. The gun skittered across the wooden walkway and came to rest near the boots of Marshal Kane, who'd come running at the sound of gunfire. Kane was older than Briggs, grayer, with the kind of steady eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. That's enough, Kane shouted, his own gun drawn but pointed at the ground. Both of you step back. Silas released Briggs and raised his hands, breathing hard. The deputy slumped against the wall, clutching his wrist and glaring with pure hatred. He attacked me, Briggs snarled. Tried to kill me. Arrest him. But Marshal Kane was looking at the scattered crowd, reading their faces. These were people who'd lived in fear of Vernon Briggs for too long. And now something had shifted. Someone had finally stood up. That true? Kane asked the gathered townspeople. This man attacked Deputy Briggs without cause? An uncomfortable silence stretched across the street. Then slowly, an elderly woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. Marshal, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I think there's things you need to know about your deputy. Don't listen to her. Briggs spat. She's crazy. They're all crazy. But more voices were joining in now. The blacksmith spoke up about how Briggs had threatened his daughter when she wouldn't accept his advances. A merchant told about money that had gone missing from his till after Briggs had searched his shop. Story after story, each one painting a picture of a man who'd use his badge as a weapon against the very people he was supposed to protect. Marshal Kane's face grew darker with each revelation. When the townspeople finally fell silent, he looked at Briggs with something like disgust. Vernon, he said quietly, I think you better tell me about this Mercy Whitmore. I don't know any. Don't. Kane's voice cut through Briggs's protest like a blade. Don't lie to me. Not anymore. Silas stepped forward, still keeping his hands visible. "Marshal, there's a young woman working at my ranch who's been terrorized by your deputy for months. She's got bruises that tell a story no decent man should have to hear." Kane studied Silas for a long moment. Everyone in the territory knew Ward's reputation. A man who kept his word and minded his own business. If he was speaking up, it meant something serious. "These are serious charges," Kane said finally. "They're lies." Briggs shouted, but his voice cracked with desperation. "You can't believe these people overswore an officer." That's when Silas pulled out the real evidence he'd been saving. The torn piece of fabric he'd found near Mercy's cabin. Fabric that matched the shirt Briggs was wearing right now. He'd picked it up that morning while Briggs was inside, and now he held it up for everyone to see. Marshal Kane looked at the fabric, then at Briggs's shirt, then back at Silas. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of justice too long delayed. "Vernon Briggs, you're under arrest." The jail cell door clanged shut behind Vernon Briggs, with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire town. Marshal Kane turned the key with deliberate care, then hung it on the hook behind his desk, where everyone could see it. The former deputy sat on a narrow bunk, his head in his hands. Finally understanding that his reign of terror was over. "I'll need you to bring Miss Whitmore to town tomorrow," Kane told Silas as they stood outside the jail. "She'll need to give her statement officially." Silas nodded. "She'll be here." "And Ward?" Kane's weathered face was serious. "Thank you. I should have seen what was happening. Should have stopped it sooner." "We all should have," Silas replied. "But it stopped now." The ride back to the ranch gave Silas time to think about what came next. Mercy would need time to heal, time to trust that she was truly safe. But for the first time in months, she'd be able to sleep without fear. He found her sitting on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the mountains as if she was seeing them for the first time, when she heard his horse approaching. She stood up slowly, her face filled with questions she was afraid to ask. "It's done," Silas said simply as he dismounted. "Briggs is in jail. He won't be bothering you or anyone else anymore." Mercy's knees gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. For a moment, Silas thought she might faint. Then the tears came. Not the silent, desperate cry he'd seen before, but the kind of tears that wash away months of accumulated pain and fear. "I can't believe it," she whispered. I thought he'd always..." "You thought wrong," Silas said gently. "Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and say enough." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch felt different now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Mercy had arrived. The shadow that had hung over them was finally gone. "What happens now?" Mercy asked. Silas considered the question. "Now you heal. Now you remember what it feels like to be safe. And if you want to stay on here, there's always work for someone willing to do it honestly. And if people ask what happened, let them ask," Silas said. "Truth has a way of spreading faster than lies, once it gets started." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mercy Whitmore smiled for the first time in months. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. And for Silas Ward, who'd never been much for grand gestures or flowery words, that smile was worth every risk he'd taken. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns or armies, but with the simple courage to stand up when standing up mattered most. And sometimes, when a quiet rancher finally decided to speak, his voice could shake the very foundations of justice itself. The truth had set them both free.